Hello again, Econ students. So I'm here to discuss Roman numeral 3 in the notes, specifically letters A, B, and C. Letter D, if you might notice, covers externalities, and that's what tomorrow's worksheet is going to cover, worksheet number 16, I believe. But right now I'm just doing A, B, and C. And so just let me preface this section in the notes. We're talking about the role of law in the economy. And so I want to say this, okay? The question we're asking is, what role should the government play in the economy? Now, as you can imagine, the opinions on this vary widely. You get everything from an extreme conservative, who basically says the government should never do anything with the economy, up to and including socialists, who basically presume the government should control vast swaths of the economy all at once. I'm not trying to settle that debate right here, okay? That's too big of a debate to answer in a few questions. What I want to give you are, what are some things that everybody, even the most conservative person, would probably say, yes, it makes sense for the government to do these things in the economy. Now, you might notice there aren't a lot of things that everybody agrees on, as you can imagine, right? Next unit, we're going to talk more about that disagreement and talk about the different opinions and philosophies of the economy, the laissez-faire approach or the conservative approach versus the Keynesian approach, which takes a more active role. And so we'll talk about that next unit. I'm not avoiding the debate. I'm just trying to set some groundwork for what would everybody agree on. Now, there's not a lot of things, but there are 4 things. Again, even someone who's extremely conservative would probably say, yes, it makes sense for the government to do this, or the government can help out in this way. Okay, so that's letters A, B, C, and D. Then beyond that, letter E, that's after we do the externalities worksheet. Beyond that, we're just going to kind of set some guidelines or precautions for, okay, if you want the government to do more, these are some things we need to be aware of. Okay, so again, I want you to make sure you understand what I'm doing with this. I'm just talking about the things that everyone would agree, yes, these are important for the government to do in the economy. Beyond this, I am not saying that this is the only thing the government should do. I'm saying this is what everyone agrees on. Okay, the debate that goes beyond this is what we're going to do next unit. All right, but the first question, the first part of it is what's the role of law in the economy. And so I need to ask a couple questions. Even before, if you notice here on the notes I've got, letter A is way down here. So I got to cover a few things real quick in order to clarify what's going on here. So the big question is right here. Why are some countries rich and some countries poor? Okay, why are some countries wealthy and prosperous, and yet other countries, they seem to always lag behind? Now, when you ask people this question, they tend to want to give one of 3 answers, okay, or combination of. The first one, they might say, well, some countries just are blessed with natural resources. In other words, geography. They have the things that you would want. Think of oil, or think of farmable land, or think of certain natural resources historically like gold and things like that, coal, that would be valuable to an economy, right? So some nations have those things. Other nations, unfortunately, they don't. They're desert, or they're mountainous, or they're whatever else, and they simply don't have the things that you would want that are valuable. A second answer is essentially linked to history. They would say, well, some nations have had a good history, a history that has laid a soil for growth and for prosperity and things like that. Other nations, because of things like imperialism or slavery, have had an unjust history or have had a tragic history, and so that has put them behind. And then sometimes people talk about cultures. They say, well, some cultures, because of the values that are propagated in that culture, they are predisposed to economic growth. The things that they value work well, particularly in a capitalist or in a global society, and so those values are going to mean prosperity as economies unfold, whereas other cultures, they have different values, and that would change their ability to grow. Now, while those 3 are probably the most popular comments you're going to get to an answer to this question, here's my problem with those. If you apply those to wealthy countries and poor countries, you don't see a lot of correlation. Okay, so an easy example would be North Korea versus South Korea. Okay, geographically, it's the same. It's a peninsula off of China, right, is what the Korean peninsula is. It comes off of China. It's geographically the same. They're divided by an imaginary line. Okay, they have the same history, right, up until about 50, 60 years ago. But up until that time, they have the same history, and of course, they have the same culture. Why is it then that South Korea has one of the biggest economies in the world, even as tiny a nation as it is, I believe if I saw the statistics from 2019 correctly, they are the 12th largest economy in the world. And yet North Korea, okay, just a few miles south, same history, same culture, same geography, they are one of the poorest. I want to say they're about 108th on the scale of nations. So you have one of the biggest, one of the most prosperous nations in the world, one of the biggest economies in the world, and then one of the smallest economies. It can't just be because of those reasons, okay? Or you could look at certain African nations. We're going to give examples in a minute here. In certain African nations, they have, one nation, again, basically the same geography, very similar history and culture, and yet one nation is doing well and thriving, and the nation right next to it is doing poorly. Now, that being said, it seems that the difference between some of these countries like North versus South Korea, or certain African nations, nations in South America, we give examples of those, it seems that in some nations, like in South Korea, they have a consistent framework of laws. They protect property rights. They encourage investment. And because of those things, it gives them the opportunity to grow and prosper. Whereas in nations like North Korea, there has not been that consistency, or there's not been protection of property rights, or there's not been an environment that fosters positive economic growth through investment and things like that. When was the last time you heard somebody say, I want to go to North Korea and put my money there? That's the place to be. Or I want to go to Cameroon, which is also regarded as one of the more corrupt governments. I want to go to Cameroon. Nobody wants to put their money there, right? Because it's not a safe place to put their money. Okay, other places you do have that. Okay, so that's what we're going to dive into. This first point is creating a framework of laws that are specifically, like it says in number 1, consistent and reliable. Okay, so excuse me. Now, what happens here is when you have a framework of laws that are consistent and reliable and are easily enforced, again, it encourages more investment. And when you have investment, positive investment, you have positive economic activity. Again, this is a place people want to put their money because they know their interests are going to be protected. Okay? On the other hand, when laws are inconsistent and or when they're difficult to enforce, it makes it a very risky place to put their money. No one wants to go there. No one's willing to put their money there. And so they're not going to have as much economic growth. Okay, so that's an extremely important part of it, making sure that the laws the government is writing are consistent and reliable. Another big part of it kind of intertwines with this is the idea of social order. Okay, the fact that you have a culture where people generally act honestly, they act with integrity. And so, I'll give an example. In certain parts of Asia, such as Japan, such as South Korea, Hong Kong, and other places like that, honor is such an important thing to them that oftentimes they don't even sign contracts. If somebody says they're going to do something, they're going to do it. And they would literally almost rather die than not do what they said they were going to do, because honor is so important to them. Now, it shouldn't surprise us that regions like that have grown dramatically over the last 20 years. Does that sound like a group of people you would like to do business with? People that are, again, intent on delivering what they said they were going to deliver and being people of their word, right? So that's a good thing. And so, we get into the debate, can the government enforce morality on people? Can the government enforce honesty on people? No. But I think, number 1, the government can set an example by being honest and being moral in their actions and their dealings. And number 2, the government can pass laws that encourage honesty and so forth. If the only way you can make money is to be dishonest, because the government has passed regulations or laws or taxes that are so stringent you can't make money honestly, that's a bad precedent. Okay, so the government can't mandate that people behave that way, but they can act morally themselves, and they can also pass laws that encourage morality. So if you have that type of environment, you are going to have a thriving economic culture, I promise you, right? And that's some of the differences between some of these nations. A second key component of this are protection of property rights. So first of all, the definition of property rights right here, the right to exclude someone from using what you own. Now, when you say it that way, that sounds negative, right? That sounds like a bad thing, okay? So in theory, that means that yes, you can stop other people. So for example, you can come up to me and say, hey Mers, can I borrow your car? I would have the right to say, no, that's my car, get your own car, right? Or I could say yes, but that's my right to say yes or no. And so it seems like there's a negative there, but it actually creates positives. Because while, for example, General Mills could make a warehouse full of Lucky Charms and then lock their doors and make sure that nobody ever gets to taste the magical goodness of Lucky Charms, it's actually not their incentive. They want to make Lucky Charms, and they want to make sure that as many people as possible get to taste Lucky Charms and have it for the breakfast or whatever, right? So yes, they can make it and say this belongs to us. Nobody else gets to use it. More often than not, when you have a stake in something, you want other people to enjoy it because that's how you make money off of it, right? And so it actually encourages production, the production of goods and services, and it encourages them to be disseminated. Okay, the other part of property rights, though, is so that it gives the incentive, two important incentives. Okay, number one, the incentive to be efficient. Okay, pretty simple. If I have a stake in what I own, I'm going to be more likely to take care of it. Okay, because by taking care of it or by using it efficiently and wisely, I get the chance to make more money off of it. This is why you generally don't need to tell homeowners to keep up with their lawns, to repaint when needed or fix things that are broken, right? A lot of homeowners naturally do this because I've paid money for this house. If I keep it nice, I can potentially resell it for even more money than I paid for it later on, right? And so whenever you allow somebody to own something, they tend to be efficient with it because that usually leads to a better return. And the other thing is the incentive to conserve. I always say this, if you want something to be taken care of, let somebody own it. Think of the things that we don't take care of. Almost always it's the things that we don't own. Why do people pollute the air? Generally, nobody owns the air. Why do people pollute the water? People don't own water for the most part. So the things that we don't own are the things that we tend to not take very good care of. There's a great example in Africa, two nations, you had Tanzania and Botswana. Both nations were struggling with the same problem, and that was a dwindling elephant population. Elephants were on the verge of extinction because people were poaching them to get their tusks for the ivory. Okay, so you have both countries, Tanzania, Botswana, were struggling with the same problem, elephant poaching. They went about it in very different ways. In Tanzania, they made the sale of ivory legal for certain companies. In other words, certain companies were allowed to own elephants and produce elephants for the purpose of getting their ivory. Now, Botswana, the other country, they went a different route. They made the sale of ivory completely illegal. You could not manufacture, produce, sell, or purchase ivory in that nation. Okay, so two countries, two very different strategies. Tanzania allowed certain companies to own elephants and utilize them for tusk production, for ivory production. In Botswana, they made elephant and tusk ivory sales completely illegal. Now, can you guess in which nation the elephant population thrived and grew, and which nation the elephant population continued to dwindle? Well, guess what? In Tanzania, where they allowed for the legal sale of ivory, the elephant population grew. Now, why is that? Well, it's pretty simple. These companies that owned elephants, they built fences, and they hired guards to protect their elephants. They brought in veterinarians to make sure the elephants were healthy, because if the elephants go extinct, they lose their business. They now have a stake in what's happening, and they have an incentive to take care of what they own. In Botswana, the elephant population continued to dwindle because they either bought and sold ivory illegally or smuggled it to other countries where it was still legal. And so no one had a stake in it. No one was protecting those elephants. And so when you want something to be protected, let it be owned. Another good example, and people often think this doesn't make sense, but you can look this up. There are actually more trees in America today than there were 100 years ago. And I know that seems probably hard to believe. The question I have is, who's planting all these trees? And you might think, well, environmentalist groups or this and that. There's one group that plants more trees than any other group, and that is logging companies. And I know you're saying, wait a minute, I thought logging companies hated trees. Isn't it why they cut them down so brutally and with cruelty and everything else? No, if we run out of trees, logging companies are out of business. So their rule has always been, for every tree they cut down, they plant two, because they have a stake in it. They don't want to run out of trees. So they're making sure that trees are staying replenished because they own it and they have a stake in it. So I always say, if you want something to be taken care of, let it be owned. People will take good care of it. So those are two important incentives you get from property rights. All right, and then two of these are going to be much faster. Letter B, setting standards, such as units of measurement. This is pretty simple. This is not very controversial. Again, imagine if you went to every single state, and each state had its own currency. Each state had its own units of measurement. Some used the metric system, some used the English system, some used whatever. That would make it very difficult to travel. That would make it very difficult for states to trade with one another, and it just wouldn't make a lot of sense. So by having uniformity, okay, among the different states, it fosters more economic activity. A really quick example, when trains were first starting to come out, you had different companies that would lay train rail at different widths. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, because now if you make a train, you have to make it based on this track or this track, and it's not going to operate on all tracks. So it didn't take too long for the government to come out and set a standard and say, hey, let's lay all train at this width. That way, everyone who makes trains sets the wheels at that width. Everyone who lays trains sets the tracks at this width. And so it doesn't matter, any train can run on any track in this country. That just makes sense. Yeah, not pretty easy, not controversial. And then lastly, a third one for today, and then a fourth one is tomorrow with externalities, providing public goods. Okay, so the two definitions of public goods, and I'll explain this, is what we call non-exclusivity and non-rivalry. Okay, now most goods are not public goods. Most goods are private. Private goods means there's exclusivity. Exclusivity means if you don't pay for it, you don't get it. Okay, so you can walk into a Foot Locker and say, I want that pair of shoes, but if you don't pay for the pair of shoes, they're not going to give it to you. Okay, most goods in our economy are private, meaning that there's exclusivity. You don't get it unless you pay for it. The other characteristic is rivalry. Okay, most goods in this country have rivalry. Rivalry means that if I'm using it, you can't use it at the same time. So I've got on a pair of shoes right now. I'm wearing the shoes. You can't also wear the shoes at the same time. We are rivals over them in a sense. I can take my shoes off and give them to you, and you can put them on, but now I don't have them. Okay, if I eat a cheeseburger, you can't eat that same cheeseburger. Okay, most goods have rivalry. Now what's different about public goods is they don't have exclusivity. In other words, everybody gets it no matter what, whether or not you pay. And number two, there's non-rivalry in that we can all use it at the same time, essentially. So one of the best examples of this is national defense. Okay, so let me give a pretty easy example here. Let's say that I pay my taxes faithfully. Okay, every year I pay my money to the government, I pay my share. My neighbor, on the other hand, he either doesn't pay his taxes, or he cheats on his taxes, or maybe he doesn't work, he doesn't pay that for that reason. But let's say my neighbor pays nothing in taxes. Okay, so I've paid taxes, my neighbor has not. Can the government protect my house from nuclear attack, but not also protect my neighbor's house? That would be very difficult, right? That's an example of a public good. National defense is a public good. It's one of those things, if our nation's protected, we're all kind of protected, whether or not we've paid, and we can all get it at the same time. It's not like I get it one day, my neighbor gets it one day, we're all getting it simultaneously. Okay, so national defense is a great example of a public good because we all get it, whether or not we pay, and we can all get it simultaneously. Now, I don't say this often, but the free market does not do a very good job with providing public goods. It does a wonderful job with providing private goods. Public goods are a little bit different because once people realize that whether or not they pay, they get it anyway, okay, and we all get it at the same time. Well, imagine national defense being coordinated through a private company. Let's say that the company relied on donations, right? And so I'm concerned about foreign affairs and things like that. So every year I faithfully send a check off to this company to provide defense for our nation. My neighbor, on the other hand, he's more aloof. He doesn't care about what's going on in the world. He's not concerned. He doesn't pay anything. Again, how long is it going to take for me to realize that if I don't send my check this year, marginally, it's not going to really change the level of protection I get. My neighbor hadn't been sending a check for years, and yet he's getting the same level of protection I am. Now, as soon as I realize this as a consumer, I'm not going to send money. But what happens if nobody sends money? We don't get national defense. It's really hard to get people to pay for something that they know they get no matter what. Okay, so it makes more sense for the government to provide public goods to coordinate through taxes the collection of money and the distribution of the goods. Okay, so national defense is one of the best examples. You could also say roads and highways for the most part. Once a road is built, whether or not you live in Lexington, whether or not you've paid taxes to Lexington, if you're driving through Lexington, you get to use the road just like everybody else. Public parks, public art, you know, you build a statue or a fountain downtown Lexington, again, whether or not you pay taxes, you get to enjoy it. And everyone we can all drive by and look at it at the same time. So those are good examples of things that are public goods. And like I said, the free market simply does not do a good job of providing public goods. Okay, so those two qualities, the characteristics, those are important. Okay, if you have further questions about that, something that didn't make sense, again, as always, send me an email or a text. We'd be glad to get back to you. And until next time, stay healthy.